Anyway, I'm going to talk about Isaac tonight, and you know, I'm trying to keep from. It take forever. It take 2 or 3 Sundays to talk about Isaac. So this is real brief, as brief as I can make it, and I wanted it to make sense. And when I looked at the outline and looked at my lesson, I thought, man, that's kind of confusing. So I gave you that little piece of paper just so you'll see how I got it organized in my pea brain. I'm going to talk about Abraham and Isaac, just an overview. That's the first thing I'll talk about. And then next I'll talk about Isaac as a son and the promises of God that were to Abraham and to Isaac. And then I'll talk about Abraham sacrifices Isaac, go back in time to that. And then I'll talk about Isaac as a husband, and then we'll wrap it up. So in Genesis 21, beginning at verse 5 and 6, Genesis, we'll be at Hebrews too, Hebrews chapter 11 here in just a minute. Genesis 21, beginning at verse 5 and 6. Genesis 21, verse 5. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And we know what happened there, don't we? They wanted a baby so bad, and there's a lot of in-between there that we're not going to talk about, but she was in a tent, if you remember, and the angels came and told Abraham, you're going to have a child, and he kind of took him back a little. He's 99 at that time, going to be 100, and the reaction of Sarah in the tent was, she laughed, didn't she? Hee, you know, tee-hee. Boy, you got to be kidding, she's saying to herself. And the angel said, you laughed. And she said, no, I didn't. And it all came true. And so when you look at that verse, and then you go to Hebrews chapter 11, beginning at verse 17, the heroes of faith, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, Isaac, in Isaac your descendants shall be called. He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. So Abraham is going to offer up Isaac as his only son, and those are the promises that God has through Isaac, and continues on through Jacob. And so it was really interesting because he is a type of Christ. So Isaac is one of those people in Bible history that very little good or bad is said about him, really. He wrote, if we wrote a sketch about Isaac and you subtracted everything about Abraham and Rebekah, there's very little left for Isaac to say about him. Most everything we read, Isaac is in a secondary role, not a primary role, except a few places we'll look at. If we sum up his record in Genesis, Isaac was about 18 to 25 years old when God told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. In our minds, we're thinking Isaac was probably a lot younger, like 8 to 10, but he wasn't. I have a hard time understanding that, but we'll talk about that in a second. At 40, he married Rebekah, and he was 60 years old when the twins were born, Jacob and Esau. He was 137 years old when Jacob deceived Esau. And you know how he did that with the bolus red stew, took his birthright. And then Isaac died at 180. His father, Abraham, was called by God, and we know so much about Abraham, don't we? We know what, it's just go on endlessly. What we know about Abraham is revealed to us. And we know so much about him. And Isaac's son Jacob was his son of Isaac that's going to have the promises of God. And he also changes his name to Israel, and you get the 12 tribes of Israel. Isaac lived quietly all his life. He was kind of in the background. He was a peaceful man, and he was pretty quiet. He's submissive in obedience to God. He didn't give a whole lot of trouble. And so not all the founders of Israel were in that heroic mode in Hebrews chapter 11, and Isaac's one of them. He's not in a heroic type mode. They were like Isaac. They were just ordinary people, ordinary Hebrew people. That's what Isaac was. He stayed one place. He didn't go traveling around. He was easygoing. It seems to be content to receive the promises of God without realizing the extent or the nature of the privilege that he had. In Genesis 35, beginning at verse 28. Genesis 35 and beginning at verse 28. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years. We're just going to go right to his death, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Isaac breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people, an old man of ripe age, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. So we see Isaac and Jacob making up after 20 years. They come back together. Now let's look at Isaac as a son. We're going to look at him as a son. In his case, it's impossible to have too great a father. His father is just great. That's about all you can say. And it seems Abraham sheltered Isaac just a little. As a result, the presence of Abraham kind of overshadowed Isaac's life. God chose Isaac from the beginning. From the very beginning, he chose him. Isaac was the child of promise. So when Abraham was first called by God, God said, through him all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Let's look at that promise in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 through 3, and then we're going to go and look at Isaac's promise from God. Genesis 12, 1 through 3. Now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country. By the way, he's 75 years old, and he's going to pack up and leave his family and everything he knew. And so he go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to a land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. So you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and the ones who curses you I will curse. In you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Now let's go look at the promise he made to Isaac. Genesis 26, beginning at verse 2. Genesis 26, beginning at verse 2. The Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt. He doesn't want him going anywhere. His daddy did. And stay in the land which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands. I will establish the oath which I swore to your father Abraham. I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and will give your descendants all these lands, and by your descendants all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Isn't that amazing? It just carries on. When Isaac was born, Abraham, like I say, was 100, and Sarah was 99. Now you see why people laughed. They laughed for joy, I guess, I would think. Remember when the angel told Abraham that he and Sarah would have a child? Sarah, she's listening from the tent, and she laughs. And so when a child is born, look what she names him, Isaac. You know what that means? It means laughter. Isn't that something? She named him Isaac, which means laughter, and it was a good name for a supernatural birth that would only be accomplished by God. What is amazing to me is Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, and that's what we're going to talk about real quick. This event was commanded by God, and it was commanded to test his faith. But I'm not sure it was just Abraham's faith that was being tested. It could have also, I've never looked at it that way. I got to tell you the truth. I've never looked at Isaac's side of it. He was between 18 and 25 years old. It was a great test to him too. Can you imagine? Let your dad tie you up and take a knife and he's going to sacrifice you? And we'll look at that more here in just a second. Well, I tell you what, let's go ahead. The event was commanded by God, and Abraham had to move by faith. It was a test of his faith, and it was also a test of Isaac's faith. Genesis 22. In Genesis 22, beginning at verse 1. Genesis 22, beginning at verse 1. I'll read 1 through 17. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. And he said, Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I will tell you. Well, by the way, Jim and Marcia went to that place, to that mountain. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife, so the 2 of them walked together. Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering. That's faith, isn't it? That's faith, my son. So the 2 of them walked on together. Then they came to the place which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. He said, Here I am. And he said, Do not stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Verse 13. Then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram was caught in the thicket by the horns. And Abraham went up and took the ram and offered him up on a burnt offering in the place of his son. Abraham called the name of the place, The Lord Will Provide, as it is said to this day, In the mount of the Lord it will be provided. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son, indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I'll greatly multiply your seed as the stars of heaven, as the sand on the seashore, and your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. Quite a happening right there. And he built an altar on Mount Moriah, and we know exactly where that was. It's where the temple is in Jerusalem. Well, now the Muslims have built the Dome of the Rock on top of it. And so this event amazes me because I've always thought in my mind, and maybe you have too, I see a picture of only Isaac being about 10 to 12 years old and just doing what his father said. But he's doing what his father says, and he's about 18 to 25 years old. He is stronger than Abraham. I'll be willing to run a test and see. What's amazing, it causes me to rethink this event. God tested Abraham's faith in this. God never intended for Isaac to be offered, did he? Never intended for that to happen. But Abraham and Isaac did not know that. They did not know that. Abraham kind of had faith enough to know that God will prepare. God will prepare it. God will take care of it. And even if he is killed, God can raise the dead. You heard him say that. Abraham believed if Isaac died, that God would either raise him up from the dead or that, like he said, God will provide the lamb. So my attention has always been on Abraham. I never really thought much about Isaac's part. If Isaac was this old, look at his faith he had. And that's the thing. Isaac had it was a great test of his faith also. He had the time to think about this. He had it laying there and he's being still. He had plenty of time to think about this. And it would be hard for Abraham to do this too without the consent and trust of Isaac. Abraham is old. Isaac is young and strong. It took a great faith on both of them, I do believe. But I believe that this is the point. He allowed it, and without resistance. And he was a type of Jesus Christ who went to that cross and didn't fight a bit. He was beaten and tortured. He was flogged up until the point of just before he died. They got him to the point of death. They cut all his skin all around him. And then they nailed him to he carried his cross, and then they nailed him to the cross. I thought about this many times, about Isaac just laying there. Just laying there. And his daddy with a knife in his hand. He was a type of Jesus Christ. Look at what Isaac asked again in Genesis 22 and verse 7. Isaac asked Abraham, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? What does Abraham say? God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Genesis 22 and verse 8. He will do that. He had faith in Almighty God. Abraham trusted in God, but so did Isaac. Isaac was to be in succession to Abraham. He was to be in the line to bring Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world, into the world through his line. Here it seems that Isaac was willing. He gave himself up. A great surrender to God for both Abraham and Isaac. And you look at Isaac as the husband now. If you notice that little piece of paper, I'm going to talk about that now. I'm going to talk about Isaac as a husband.
Can I ask you about something like that? How do you know how he was that you first thought that, but now he's doing this? But how do you know?
You have to go back and go through the ages of everything. You get the point. He was born when he was 100 years old, and you know when he was circumcised, and you know what happened with his family, with Ishmael and all of that. You have to put all that together. I'll show you after this. When you look at Isaac the husband, before Abraham died, he was subject to Abraham until he was 40 years old. He was 40 years old when he was subject still to Abraham. And then he married Rebekah until she died. He was a son of that famous Abraham. And Abraham had a clever wife who he was ordered to care for and manage all his life. And the lives of Isaac and Rebekah was full of beauty. Isaac married Rebekah, and we know all about the wedding. And gracious hand of God, it guided them together. And Abraham sent his most trusted servant to go get Rebekah and bring her to Isaac. If you remember right, Isaac's in the field. He can't wait. Anticipation. It's been months since they've gotten there, and he's got a wife coming, and he sees them in the distance. Well, I'm getting ahead, so let's go back to Abraham's homeland, where he knew it would be someone because he was a worshiper of God. And Sarah had been dead about 3 years. So having Rebekah would be a great addition to the family. It would be someone that would help Isaac at the loss of his mother. So God picked Rebekah to be Isaac's wife. Genesis 24, beginning at verse 3. Genesis 24, beginning at verse 3. Abraham told a servant, and we don't know exactly who his hand-picked servant was, but it could have been Eliezer. And I will make you, he says, swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I live, but you will go to my country and to my relatives and take a wife for my son Isaac. So that's what he's telling the servant. Made him swear to it. And Rebekah was the granddaughter of Abraham's brother Nahor back in his homeland, back in the homeland of Abraham. And Rebekah agreed to the marriage, and they asked her, are you willing to go? And she says, I will go. Genesis 24, beginning at verse 63. Genesis 24, beginning at verse 63. Isaac went out to meditate in the field toward the evening. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, the camels were coming. See, I can see all this in my mind. Can you? Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from the camel, and she said to the servant, who is that man walking in the field to meet us? And the servant said, he is my master. Then she took her veil and covered herself. And the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Then Isaac brought her into his mother's tent, and he took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her, and thus Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Wow. Isaac's marriage to Rebekah brought some new challenges in his life. For 20 years they had no children. But God had a hand in this too, to teach them to depend on God. Genesis 25, beginning at verse 21. Genesis 25, beginning at verse 21. And we'll read through 28. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. And the Lord answered him and Rebekah, his wife, and his wife conceived. But the children struggled together within her, and she said, if this is so, why then am I this way? So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 people will be separated from your body. The one people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. When the days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in the womb, and now the first came forth red all over, hairy garment, and they named him Esau. Afterward, his brother came forth with his hand holding on to Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to them. When the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a peaceful man living in tents. Now Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And we got lots of problems after that. Isaac's marriage to Rebekah brought new challenges in his life. For 20 years they had no children, and they had to be taught to depend on God, and they prayed to God that she could have a child. So Esau was a hunter, Jacob was a shepherd. God will choose Jacob to continue that line to bring Jesus Christ into the world. God will change Jacob's name to Israel. He'll have 12 sons. It will be the 12 tribes of Israel. Both Abraham and Isaac, we see the customs of the people at the time where they lived. From the time Isaac settled in a place called Gerar, Isaac prospered by the hand of Almighty God. That's the only way he prospered. He redug wells that were covered up by the Philistines and then settled in that area. Isaac, now let's talk about him as a father. Talk about Isaac as a father. I'm backing up on you a little. He spent the last 40, 50 years of his life, Isaac did, his father did, Isaac, in blindness. He was incapacitated. He couldn't see. Isaac favored Esau. Rebekah favored Jacob. God had chosen Jacob to be the line for Christ to come into the world. Time won't allow us to discuss Jacob and Esau in detail, so we can only quickly cover. Esau sells his birthright to his oldest son. Jacob for a bowl of red stew. Jacob and Rebekah make a plot to fool Isaac, put on pull on Esau's clothes, and so he does, and he receives the blessing from Isaac as the firstborn. He gets the firstborn blessing. In other words, he inherits just everything, the major part of everything, almost everything. And Jacob and Rebekah do that so he can receive that blessing by making him feel and smell like Esau. As a result, Jacob has to flee from Esau because Esau wants to kill him. And that goes on for 20 years. And so only one more time do we hear of Isaac. And that's it when he dies. Jacob returns after 21 years from Mesopotamia. Jacob and Esau meet, and they put all the bad feelings aside. Esau's calmed down, and Jacob and Esau make amends. Then Isaac dies at 180 years old. Esau and Jacob come together. They bury their father, whom they loved. Genesis 35, beginning at verse 27. I'll read it again. Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre of Kiriath Arba. That is Hebron. That's the way I'd rather say it. Where Abraham and Isaac had sojourned. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years. Isaac breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people, an old man of ripe age. His sons Esau and Jacob buried him. So Isaac is not a hero like Abraham was. Abraham was a hero. He was a mighty man. Isaac remained faithful to God all his life. He obeyed God in his life. Isaac looked to God as the source of every blessing, but you never read of him being a friend of God. Like Abraham, but he was faithful to God his entire life. Isaac was a plain man, I'd call him. A plain man. He just worshiped God like you and I. There was nothing written as a eulogy for Isaac other than what we have just read when he died. But he was always a man of faith in God. That's why he's in the heroes of faith in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 20. Isaac was a man of faithfulness. He was a man of gentleness. He was a man of goodness. He was passive. He wasn't active. And there is something touching about the life of Isaac. He was a man of meekness, gentleness, blameless, and his great strength was he trusted in God and His Word. That should be our strength today as a Christian. That's the way we should be. Our strength should be like Isaac. We should look to him for an example, because God today has a plan to save us, and we know what it is. Those that have become Christians, and so since we're all Christians here tonight, then we have to ask ourselves by looking at this real quickly, are we living the example that Isaac set of gentle, faithful, goodness, and a passive life for God every day of our life? It's touching about Isaac. And people, as brothers and sisters in Christ, we appreciate that kind of life from each other. And we grow from it. And the question is, are we doing that? Are we living that kind of an example? That takes care of it for tonight. If we can help in any way, won't you come while we stand and sing?